Hey everyone, welcome back to Grid Chat. I am your host, Marissa Tandon, and today we had one of the most chaotic and very scary race weekends that we've had all season. And thankfully, I won't have to talk about that all by myself because Neha is here. Neha is an amazing content creator that I am very lucky to have met on the internet and then in person. And now I'd like to call her a friend. I feel like once you hang out in multiple cities, you get to be friends.
We are friends. We hung out in Miami. We hung out in New York. We are friends now. And you can't get rid of me. I'm so sorry.
I'm so sorry. It seems like we're stuck together.
Dang it.
Well, please welcome Neha to the podcast. I'm very excited to have you here.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited. I love listening to your podcast. So this is so fun to be on here and get to talk about this insane race. So
I'm actually so glad. Sometimes I find that just by like nature of who I have planned, the race ends up going in the direction that it's like, oh, this was the perfect person to bring.
And we planned this months ago too.
Yeah,
like this is not anything that we were like, oh, we're just going to do this like on the fly. No, we planned this months ago. And then Brazil was just like, here you go. You get to talk about probably the most insane race ever.
Brazil was like, do you have someone that wants to talk about tire strategy, technicalities, data? All of those things are going to be really important today. And so here we are. Well, this weekend, I feel like we should just jump right into it. But before we do, because you are new to the podcast and people may not have seen your videos before, I like to just start off with how did you get into Formula One and who is your favorite driver or team that you support?
Yes, I got into Formula One when was it? In 2013 is when I first recognized this as a real sport. I grew up in Detroit, so IndyCar was kind of where my allegiance lied for a really long time because the Detroit GP was there. But my dad lived in Detroit for years and years and years before, so he used to go to Formula One when they used to run in Detroit, which I still wish that existed. But IndyCar existed when I was a kid, and then I was randomly as a child on the internet and then saw this character, Lewis Hamilton. I was like, oh, who's Lewis Hamilton? Like, he looks really interesting. Who's Sebastian Vettel? He looks really interesting, world champion. That's really fun. And then in 2016, I had the privilege of getting to work at Mercedes-Benz as a tech intern, because that's my real job. I'm a software engineer. And doing that, they were introducing us to their different projects. And one of those was the AMG project. And they were like, oh, our Formula One team, Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg. And I was like, I'm so sad. Because this was 2016. This was like the thick of it.
The peak, yes.
I'm like, when I think about that, I'm like, I think I entered the sport in probably the best way that I could as a Mercedes lover now. Like, looking back, I'm like, I wish I got into it earlier because I would have loved to live through the Mercedes times. But yeah. I am very happy that the relationship dynamic that was Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg driving that car in 2016 and that internship just brought everything together. So now here we are, surrounded by my Sebastian Vettel and my McLaren and my little Pirelli tire.
Oh, the tire is so cute, actually.
Yes,
for anybody who's just listening on audio, she has a crocheted, it is crochet, right? Yeah,
yes, it is crocheted.
It's like a Pirelli tire with a very angry face because it's a hard tire, obviously. So so to me, that's an angry tire.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Oh, I love that. I love that you had like an experience of actually getting to be on the other side of it, like the actual thick of being a part of Mercedes at maybe the best part of.
And I wasn't part of the team or anything, like not the Formula One team. It was just the company and I was a tech intern there. But I think it made me feel this like kinship to Mercedes, but more so to Lewis. And I think that's why he's always been my favorite driver. Seb is a close second, but Lewis has always been my favorite driver. And as much as I want to say Mercedes is my favorite team, I think it has become Ferrari since I want to say 2017. And then now with all of the Charles and Lewis of it all, it's perfect.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like every really big Lewis fan is going through that right now. Mm-hmm. And most people are shifting to becoming future Ferrari fans.
Yes.
So I think it's a not unique, but shared experience that we're all having right now. So
definitely.
Fair enough.
Kind of feels like, I don't know, maybe a little bit of imposter syndrome. Cause I'm like, am I a Mercedes fan or am I just a Lewis Hamilton fan? And I think everyone is kind of going through that right now.
Yeah, I definitely went through it and I came to the conclusion that I was a Mercedes fan, but the part that I was a fan of was the dynamic that Lewis had with the team. And so when the breakup went so poorly,
Mm-hmm.
you're like, oh, well, maybe I never was a Mercedes fan. Maybe I've always
Maybe.
been. What can you do?
What can you do? But yeah, that's me, and
Yeah.
very happy to now have, like, a bunch of other people I can talk to, like, about Formula 1, because really there was no one, and you'd think
Yeah.
that there would be more people. There was no one, and now there's everyone, and I love it so much.
Yeah, it's genuinely expanded so much, and I think it's honestly, sports in general have expanded so much. You and I
Oh, yeah.
both are, like, content creators who make other sports content as well,
Yes.
and so it's been interesting to see sort of the different dynamics of seeing more people talking about football, more people talking about basketball, more people talking about Formula 1, like, I think the
Yes.
expansion across the board has been big this year, so
It's been
it's exciting.
great. It's been
Yeah,
awesome, and I think that it's all, just, like, within the Formula 1 community, because there are also people who have, like, their niche other interests, it's so easy for, like, even people who only watch Formula 1 now to broaden their interests a bit, and that
yeah.
makes it even more fun to talk about all the sports.
Exactly, agreed. I also think it's really interesting. I won't go on a full tangent about this because we have so much to talk about
We
this
have a
week,
lot to talk about, yes.
but I do think it's interesting. We see so much conversation about the idea that Drive to Survive was the thing that, like, blew up Formula 1
Mhm.
in America, and I know people have kind of different feelings about that, right? Like, it's objectively definitely was a large part of it. Not the only thing that made Formula One successful in
Yes.
America, but a turning point for sure. But what's interesting is that the NHL actually went to box this year and said, "We saw what Drive to Survive did for Formula One. We just
Mhm.
want to do the exact same thing." And so they actually just released a show it's called Face Off NHL. It's following their players, and you can get the exact same experience that you had with Drive to Survive if you're interested in being a hockey fan, because they literally went to the same production company and they were like, please just replicate the extremely amazing experience you just had.
I'm happy all the sports are kind of doing that whole thing where they branch out and try to attract different audiences, because sometimes it's just like watching a game is not going to be enough,
Yeah,
and having that human element is super important.
agreed. Okay, well, let's talk about the humans that are the part of Formula One with this race,
These
because
20 humans.
20 guys going around and zooms. This was so stressful. I don't know about you this
Oh
weekend.
my
I
god.
just was like, I I actually yesterday was sitting there and I have like a text chain with someone and I was
Mhm.
like, do you think it's going to be another 15 minutes? Because I really need to wash my hair before I go to dinner tonight. So it's like, do I commit? Do I just, and I should have. I really should have.
It just kept going, and, like, was I knew it wasn't going to happen, but I was still sat in front of my TV waiting for qualifying to start, even though I was like, "The rain is continuing to fall, like,
Yeah.
torrentially. I know that we're not gonna have a qualifying session today." But for it to move to Sunday morning is I don't think I've ever actually watched a race where they've had qualifying on a Sunday morning live before. I have,
Yeah.
like, obviously on, like, replays F1 TV, but this was the first time waking up that early. Criminal. I did not
This
like that.
was Yeah, so the last time that qualifying has happened on the same day as the race was in Japan in
20
2019 for
Yeah.
Suzuka, because they had a typhoon, which,
Yes.
you know, I
You know,
guess sure.
that
Um,
happens.
Sometimes I think about it and I was like, can you imagine, like, going to work and sitting there and then being told, "You know what? Let's come back tomorrow morning. There's a typhoon on its way." Like, think
It's
about
like,
it later.
"Whoops."
Yeah, sorry. It's like, okay, yeah, I guess I'll get up earlier on a Sunday. Which is funny because yeah, the time change actually today was the
Mhm,
worst day ever because we had daylight savings time. And so the Formula 1 app said 2:30. I went
mhm.
through an extreme amount of time trying to figure out, did they mean 2:30 after daylight savings time or 2:30 at 2:30, which would be because daylight savings time changes at
At
2
2.
a.m. and
Yeah.
it goes back to 1. So when you look at the app, it's like, oh, it's in an hour and a half, which it said at 1 o'clock in the morning. So I was like, okay, so you mean 2:30, but but the real 2:30. Like you mean
It's time is just a concept, is really
it's
what it is.
and also it wasn't the real 2:30. It was the daylight savings time 2:30. So
Yeah.
when on the app, the little countdown, it
Mhm.
changed. It said an hour and a half. It got to 2 o'clock. It got down
Mhm.
to right before 2 o'clock. So at
Mhm.
1:59, it said
Ha
31 minutes.
yeah.
Then at 2 o'clock, when it changed back to 1, the timer changed to an hour and a half. And I said, you know what? I quit.
Honestly, fair. And I was like, "Okay, I'll wake up at 5 in the morning. I will," because also I'm based in New York.
Mm,
Marissa is obviously
yeah.
in LA. But I was like, "I'll wake up at 5 in the morning. It'll be fine, and then I can go back to sleep because pretty long day today. 5 to 6, easy qualifying." No,
No.
qualifying was from 5 to 7?
Yes.
Excuse me?
I was like, I just don't even know what to do at this point. Do I do I lay down? Do I cry? I've been awake for 1,000 hours.
It was just 2 days jam-packed with Formula 1 action, and it's like, as a fan, obviously, I'm like, "Yes, this is great. I'm so happy that we are getting so much of cars on track." But I'm not gonna lie, I'm exhausted,
Yeah,
and I'm happy
same.
we have a break before Vegas because I think I desperately need that after this triple header.
Yeah, I'm gonna need, like, at least I guess we get 2, right? We get 2 Sundays of
Yes.
sleeping in. Can't wait.
Thank goodness.
Cannot wait. And then we'll
Much
have the
needed.
latest race on earth for Vegas, so it'll be
Yes.
fun.
Unless we end up there, which is who knows?
Which, it could it's stranger things have happened,
Stranger
actually.
things have happened. Yes.
Before we get into qualifying in the main race of the weekend, we should talk a little bit about the energy leading up to the Grand Prix, because I
Yes.
think we were coming in off of criticism of Max last weekend and the weekend before about the way that he was driving. And I am curious about your thoughts, because last weekend we had George say 19 out of 20 drivers agree that we should change this rule, which also everyone assumed the 20th driver was Max. Fair enough. Um, but this weekend, we have a number of drivers actually defending the way Max has been driving and saying that everybody would be driving the same way if they were defending a championship. And George was actually one of those drivers. And so I think you had this different sort of conversation about there's one specific thing that Max did that everyone felt was out of line, which was also something that Lewis Hamilton has referenced was an issue when they were fighting for their championship,
Mhm.
and that now it's being talked about for the first time. And then when you talk about sort of the aggressiveness that Max is driving with, you have other drivers saying sort of like, yeah, I mean, any of us would do it. So did it
Yeah.
feel like an odd switch for you?
It was definitely, I don't think it was odd because also
Mm,
a lot of these guys have been racing Max for years through junior categories and through Formula 1. I and Max has always kind of raced like that. Like in
yeah.
reality, even when he's not locked in a tight championship battle, he's racing to get whatever position he can possibly get. So I think that hearing what George said last week to how drivers were reacting this week, definitely a very interesting dynamic switch. And I want to know if I'm sure they had something in that text chain or some like meeting that was like, hey, let's kind of make some or have some sympathy or say
Yeah.
something that keeps us a little bit more aligned as drivers rather than singling someone out, whether that was Max or not, who was that 20th driver. But I'm not surprised. Like they said, they would all do it too. When you like, that's the championship mentality that you kind of have to lock into when you're protecting that championship for now the fourth time.
Hmm.
He's going to want to do anything and everything to keep it, especially when Lando has been doing a good job of trying to keep as close as possible. But let's be real, Max has been doing a better job trying to mitigate any possible damage. So I don't think it's surprising at all that like Max or like everyone else is like, I would do it too, because that's exactly what you should be doing is like
Yeah.
not driving carelessly, but driving to kind of keep that championship hope
Yeah.
alive.
Absolutely. I think also I did wonder if maybe their feelings about it were that not necessarily one or the other, but that the
Mhm.
conversation before was about a specific
Yes.
penalty, and the fact that 2 races ago it wasn't called, last race it was
Yes.
called, and that last race, honestly, Max was driving a little dangerously, which I think
Yeah.
we were pretty clear about on the podcast last week. And the week before, Max was driving strategically within the rules that are still there. And so it's like
Yes.
when you look at that change, I wondered if they were perhaps, especially because of how short those interviews are, I wondered if they
Mhm.
were not necessarily saying, "Oh, we've changed our mind. This rule
Yeah.
shouldn't be changed," or if they were saying that rule is still we want it to be changed, but
Yeah.
also any of us would do the same thing within the current regulations, I guess is the word
Yes.
I'm looking for.
I guess both of the things can definitely be true at the same time,
Yeah.
where that, like, Max in Mexico, that should never happen, but then
Mhm.
also, like, when you're defending a championship, sometimes you have to do anything that you possibly can to get the job done.
Yeah. And then I think the interview that actually really set the tone for the weekend from Max is Lando was asked about something, and his sort of moment was saying that he doesn't need to change anything about the way he drives. If anyone does, it's Max, which was then brought up to Max in an interview, to which Max, I've been trying to find a word that I wouldn't have to cut out of the podcast to describe his response,
Mhm.
and I don't really think there is one. So you guys can, I'll leave it up to your imagination, because Max simply held up 3 fingers and said, "3-time world champion. I don't need to change anything." I mean, then he went out and did what he did this weekend. And I was like, I think Max is locked in. Max is always locked in, right? But
Yes.
Max does get emotional. Max drives emotionally sometimes.
Mhm.
I think Max makes mistakes when he's further back on the grid.
For
And
sure.
this weekend,
Was
there
not
was
one of
none of that at
those.
all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have to say, this Grand Prix was probably my favorite Max win of all time.
Yeah.
You could hear the emotion in his voice. And I think the last time that we ever actually got that pure raw emotion from him was Abu Dhabi 2021. But
Yeah.
you could hear how, like, excited he was about this race win, how he was like, "Oh my gosh, I surged up the field, P17 to P1." Like, I you could hear that. And I like seeing him get out of the car and be so passionate. I think a lot of people, especially through the last 2 years of Red Bull dominance, were like, "Oh, like, it feels boring when Max wins." But
Yeah.
I don't think it was ever boring. It was very dominant. The reality is this was a very exciting win for him. And I think he felt that just as much as we did. And I think it was really special for that reason.
Yeah, one thing I've always felt about Max, especially in this last year, is that
Mhm.
he thrives on competition.
Yes.
And when that competition isn't really there, it's frustrating, obviously. And I think hearing the emotion in his voice and also seeing him get out of the car, the energy
Mhm.
post race, he just was so happy to have
Yeah.
really done what he needed to do. Like, he
Yeah.
came out there, he showed what he's made of, and it was a
Yeah.
great drive.
Like, he was racing, and I think, like,
Yeah.
as much as he wants to be winning, you also want to have that competition, those battles on track, and I think that this race, as chaotic as it was, gave him everything that he needed in, like, the first 2 laps, and then strategically, Red Bull kind of killed it with keeping him out. My goodness. There were so many things that happened
Yeah.
that we'll get through all of that.
Yeah, there's so much. Well, we can talk about that was the thing that I thought really set the stage for the weekend, was just
Yes.
Max was so locked in,
Yes.
and he really stayed there. You can feel this sort of turn from him. Um,
Definitely.
and I loved it. I was really happy to see it. But I think when we talk about the sprint race, that's the first really big situation we have. Um,
Yes.
and after sprint qualifying, I want to talk about this a little bit more in depth, because I think on social media, especially on TikTok and Instagram, where you only have 90 seconds to talk about things,
Mhm.
there's not really a lot of space for nuance, which is why we have a
Yes.
podcast
Shout out.
where we can talk for as long as we want. Lando has this interview after sprint qualifying where he's asked about the championship. He's asked about sort of Max qualifying behind him, Lando qualifying ahead. And the question is started to be asked, how do you feel about your championship chances? And Lando does speak on top of her. And he does say, "I hate that question. It's the same question every week. I don't care. I'm just going to do my job." And sort of continues to talk on top of her, trying to pivot the question. And it's sort of, I'm not going to say any of these drivers have great mentalities every single week. I think
Mhm.
everybody has had some sort of press moment where they've
Sure.
sort of stepped out of the line of what might be viewed as professional or kind. But I don't think it's a unique to him issue, but I do
Mhm.
think it was a interesting way for him to start the weekend. And I don't know how you felt about that interview.
I definitely agree. It was very interesting in that I understand that he doesn't like this question. I understand that it gets asked a lot, but this is the big topic right now. The
Yeah.
fact that Max Verstappen finally has someone close enough where he's like the championship isn't a complete blowout and McLaren is ahead in the constructors standings. There are questions that are going to be asked about the championship and how he feels about it, because he is one of 2 human beings who is so locked in to this thing. And basically, if whoever makes the mistake first is going to basically lose out on a lot. Like, the stakes are very high. We only have now 3 races left at the beginning of the weekend. Obviously, Brazil was still in the numbers, but right now, or in that moment, it was a very odd way for him to go about this, because he like, I guess it's just like a maybe in the heat of the moment
Yeah.
situation, but honestly, I did not think that was the right way to approach that question, especially because I was very clear that she was trying to be like, okay, you do not like this, let's go somewhere else. And
Yeah.
he was not letting her go about that. So I think it might have just been like a heat of the moment thing.
Yeah, I think the part that was irking me as much was the fact that she was like, "Okay, then let's pivot. Clearly, you're,
Yeah.
like, not happy with this question."
Yeah.
And I think also, especially in Formula 1, I've been a little critical of some of the questions that have been asked by reporters in
Hmm.
pretty tense moments. Like, my best example I can think of that really irked me was when Logan Sargent was asked to his face, "How does it feel to be the worst driver on the grid?" Um, and he was sort of like, how do you answer that
How
question?
do you
Like,
answer
that's
that?
not a real question. So I do think
It's
sometimes
honestly just
reporters.
disrespectful. At
Yeah,
like that, the question was disrespectful. I don't think that this question was
exactly.
disrespectful.
Yeah, I thought the thing that I was frustrated with is it was actually one of the few times that I've seen a reporter be like, "Oh, you're reacting emotionally. That's okay. We
Hmm.
can pivot the conversation," and attempting to try to pivot it and just sort of being spoken on top of. And I thought that was uh, it was frustrating, definitely a heat of the moment thing. I think Lando had a lot of heat of the moment responses this weekend, and I mean, we'll get into all of them, but I think that part was when I've looked at it and been like, "Okay, this was a frustrating way to start the weekend." It really
Yeah.
was that. It's like someone's actually throwing you kind of a bone for you not to have a bad press moment, and you're just
Yeah.
missing it, you know?
Yeah. Definitely
Um,
agree.
yeah, and I didn't think the question was out of line. I thought it was, yes, you can be frustrated by being asked the same question every day, but it's sort of the only question that anyone's gonna have at the moment, so.
But also, that's kind of what Formula One is every single weekend. How is your race? How do you feel about this? How do you feel about it's kind of repetitive. Like, that's the reality of the situation.
Yeah.
So I was surprised that this was the question that he was aggressively irked by.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that was interesting to me, when you talk about like that's sort of what Formula One is. I worked in film, or I still do, but I worked in film for a long period of time. And one of the things that I did when I first started working was I was working on a press junket for a movie. And so the
Mhm.
way press junkets work, which you've seen clips of, right? You've seen actors answering the questions from various different reporters. The way that
Mhm.
those work is that there's a hotel usually that they have a couple of rooms done in, and you see those pairings of the
Mhm.
different actors that are, or the writer or director, whatever, however they're paired in their PR zone. They're all put in one room that has the lighting, has the same little poster, and then the reporters are rotated through. And the reporters are asking 99% of the same question over and over and
Right.
over again. And those are 8 to 10 to 12-hour days that they're getting done. And those interviews are anywhere from like 5 to 10 minutes. It's not even like a particularly long and interesting way
Right.
of doing your job, right? And those actors know that it's part of your job to sit there and be charming to every single one of them, make the same little joke, try to make different jokes. And you're always going to see these little cracks where you realize, like, okay, these guys have been sitting in this room answering the same question for 8 hours,
Yeah.
and now they're making fart jokes, or now they're, rolling their eyes or getting a little tired or whatever. Those things are always going to happen, and you're going to see those cracks. But everybody knows it's part of the job. And I think that's the part where not only Lando, every driver, when they have a moment where they snap like this, it's one of those things where people are like, okay, but it's part of the job. Being
Yeah.
asked about your championship contention is part of the job.
Definitely.
So
And then we head into sprint qualifying, which
yes.
was
Then yeah. So, oh my goodness. That sprint race, because the that interview was post sprint qualifying, but the rest of sprint qualifying was fascinating.
yes,
I I was
to say the
actually
least.
to say the least. I'm like, "Are you guys good?" It was shocking, I think, across the board. I think we saw a number of, cars that we weren't expecting to be so low in the grid low, and cars that we weren't expecting to be high high. It was a
Yeah.
wild weekend.
Yeah, in both sprint qualifying and qualifying, it was very mixed up. And I think that's also just how, like, at least qualifying, wet weather
Mhm.
conditions are always going to bring utter chaos in terms of how things are run, because sometimes cars just randomly perform better in wet weather conditions and because of setup changes and whatnot. Lewis Hamilton, Lewis Hamilton being
What a
low.
weekend.
I I was really sad. Like, I was kind of shocked because I mean
Yeah.
Brazil is a track for him. It's
Yeah.
his, I would call it his track. He's had some insane drives there. He's won, obviously 2008 was
Mhm.
like historic moment. 2021 insane drive both in the
Mhm.
sprint and the race. To see him qualify so low, I don't think it's a Lewis Hamilton issue.
No.
It has
I
to be a
think
Mercedes issue.
yeah, I think with Lewis this season is the season that we've been hearing a lot of this conversation about, like, is he still as good as he used to be? Will he ever be great again? Type of energy.
Mhm.
And I personally feel like we've seen so many issues from Mercedes overall from the car. Everyone's really
Yes.
aware of that. George has had issues as well. Like, I think
Yeah.
as much as we want to look at kind of or also I've noticed very highly on the commentary, we continue to hear them talk about George out qualifying Lewis throughout the
Mhm.
season. We also know that
Over
they've
the
been
last couple
testing.
of seasons,
Yeah,
honestly.
and we know they've been trying, like, split setups. We know that there have been a lot of issues that they've been working with, and we know this weekend in particular, both of them were really complaining about being in pain from the
Oh,
way
yeah.
that the car was running. And that, I think, is an interesting moment that we're looking at because we did have this addressed in the post-race press conference when Lando, Oscar, and Max were asked about the bumpiness of the track. And I think something that maybe if you're not following sort of the super technical parts or all of the different levels of this race, like perhaps you and I are because we don't have lives.
So true.
It's fine. But this track,
It got resurfaced, and then one thing that they did, which I thought was which did change the characteristics of the track, because usually when they resurface it, track is so much smoother,
mhm,
track has a lot more grip, and lap times usually get faster, but then it also contributes to a lot of graining on the tires. One thing that they did prior, because they also don't run this circuit very regularly,
right?
one thing that they did was they power washed the entire circuit, which contributed to aggressive abrasiveness on
Yeah,
the track. So again, hurting the tires. The aggressive abrasiveness, I'm really surprised at how much it affected. Not like Mercedes has dealt with all the bumpiness through
yeah,
the porpoising and whatnot, but it did genuinely affect everyone, and you could see that it was affecting everyone. I think Max was also pretty unhappy with his car on the Friday. So yeah,
yeah.
very like obviously these are things that the tracks are going to do. It's not something that's controlled by Formula 1 because the tracks and the promoters own the track and then Formula 1 like basically rents it from them.
Mhm.
But yeah, I do think it contributed to a lot of additional pain that didn't need to be there. But
Yeah.
obviously, I don't know how to run a Formula 1 circuit, so I might not be the right person to just say those things, but
Decide, yeah.
definitely that additional abrasiveness I assume contributed to a lot of the pain points, especially Lewis being like, my back. And I'm like, this is a 40-year-old man. Fernando Alonso being like, I'm finishing this race, but this is tough. And I was like,
Yeah,
my goodness, like, it doesn't sound like anyone had a fun time actually driving, maybe
yeah.
competing, but not driving.
I don't know if you saw the video of Fernando getting out of his car after the race, but he was in physical pain.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that I do think is interesting is the FIA can say whether or not a track is certified or not certified. And I do wonder, I know that they were experiencing a similar amount of bumpiness in Austin, and Oscar sort
Yes.
of was like, it's around the same slash this might have been worse.
Yeah.
And so with that, it's like, okay, we do need to look at I thought one of the interesting parts that he brought up was basically the way that the cars have to be made now is that they have
Mhm.
to run low to the
Low.
ground. And so if that's going to be the case, then the track can't be this bumpy. Because
Mhm.
if you look at like the way the cars change before they didn't run this low to the ground,
Yeah.
and so a track that was this bumpy, you would not have been in as much pain just physically. You're not
Yeah.
hitting the ground of the car anymore. So
Yeah. And
I
ride
think it's
height is like
yeah.
I think such a big thing that the teams try to game a lot because running closer to the ground, obviously the car is going to perform better,
Mhm.
but is it worth sacrificing your driver's well-being just to be that much faster? I would personally say no, just because like I don't want Lewis Hamilton at like he's almost 40, and I'm like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, it sounds like you are so unwell right now. I'm so sorry. Even Fernando Alonso, who's older, I'm like, my
Yeah.
gosh, and that these children who are also driving these cars who are like, my back. I'm like, you're
Yeah, it's interesting because I do wonder in that conversation, like,
Hmm.
who's the responsible party to make that decision?
Yeah.
Because to some degree, you're looking at it and you're saying, okay, for the team to make that decision, they're sacrificing their ability to be competitive because you'd have to have all 20 teams agree that we're definitely going to. It's kind of like in college when people used to be like, if we all don't show up to take the exam, then it's fine. But if one of you shows up to take the exam, then everybody else
Mm,
fails.
exactly.
Um, so it's like that same argument. You don't have to agree.
Hmm.
We're just all going to go slower,
Yes.
or the FIA has to have more stringent rules on the track,
Yes.
or in terms of the regulations in how much ride height they're allowed to have.
Yes.
So yeah.
But going to the sprint race, how did you feel about it? Like, I think that it was a very interesting, or it was pretty mellow for a
Yeah.
good majority of it. And then there was like the moment closer to the end that I think that was a big topic of conversation.
Yeah, I actually am glad you brought this up because honestly, I found the race to be pretty mellow.
Yeah.
And then I saw the online response to the safety car and the timing of everything. And I,
Yeah.
I was like, I think we're getting a little tin hatty, guys. Like, it's uh, very much so. I think we can have a conversation about team orders. We can have a
Hmm.
conversation about like McLaren's decision on when to swap the cars, how to swap the cars. We can talk about Lando's team radio. There are so many different things that you could talk about when it comes to this sprint race.
Hmm.
And whether it's too late really to be so certain about team orders between them and being able to catch like those team orders probably needed to be happening much earlier in this season if we wanted to be really in a place where it could be happening. The idea that the FIA waited intentionally while texting Zach Brown to ask if the cars had been swapped yet before calling the virtual safety car, I think is a bold. It's just not true. I guess is
Yeah.
what I want to
I
say.
I completely agree. I think that people really want to believe that because they want to believe like, oh, like they're in the pocket of the FI, or like FIA has blah 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 some relationship with McLaren. Obviously, like I do think that the timing of the safety car was bad that it came out so late.
Yes.
I do not think it had anything to do with the McLaren swap. That is, and both of those things can be
Yeah.
true at the same time. It's not a because then this. Like, that's
Right.
not how it works. Correlation is not caught. Like, yes.
Absolutely. I also think it's like it's sort of the same argument to say like it's interesting how the only teams that suddenly have a really good relationship with the FIA are the teams that are winning or that have a good, have a circumstance that works out for them because only a few
Yes.
races ago the same conversation was being said about Red Bull and penalties
Hmm.
and Max not getting them. So and then,
Yes.
Max getting a really intense penalty last week. So I think
Hmm.
the conversation sometimes it's the same way that like people want to blame refs in any other sport. Oh, if we had gotten the calls that, or if the calls had been more fair this weekend or in this game, we would have won because we gave up 12 free throws. Sure, but it's also part of the game. I don't
Yeah.
think anybody's ever. I mean, not anybody ever. I'm sure people have been caught in gambling and scandals and whatever. But
Yes.
generally speaking, the FIA is not texting with a team principal to figure out whether or not they're making a better championship run.
And I do think that also, like, the implementation of 2 different race directors and all
Mhm.
of that stuff was meant to also, like, mitigate that because it used to be just, like, Michael Massey acting as the race director, and now there's 2 different guys who are doing it, and they alternate. So I think when you look at it that way, it's like, they are trying to make this as fair as possible, and you might not like their decision, but let's be like, especially, like you said, we watch a lot of sports. We don't always like what the refs say. I will always get so like I'm a huge Detroit Lions fan. Anytime the refs call anything in the Lions' favor,
Mhm.
I'm so happy. I'm like,
Yeah.
yes, obviously that was a penalty, even if it wasn't. And then
Right.
sometimes when it's like the other way, I'm like, how could they do that to us? Even if it 100% is a slam dunk penalty, I'm like, that's not a face mask. Like it just happens. You want to root for your people, so you're
Right.
gonna find reasons to like figure out why your reasoning is correct. And there needs to be at least some belief that this body who is carrying out all of the rules and regulations of the sport has some integrity, or else everything falls apart.
Yeah, I do wonder sometimes, and I think I've been thinking about this since last week. Christina Lee
Hmm.
May posted, I think it was on Threads maybe, about the idea of any other sport we're able to publicly shame the refs, and you can't do that in Formula One. And I do wonder how much of it becomes much more of a conspiracy theory because like you don't see the FIA officials on TV,
Yes.
so you're not seeing those calls being made. They actually don't even come over like the
Yeah.
broadcast. They literally are just a pop-up on the top of the screen when you get a
Or
penalty
like a
or
Twitter bot
yeah.
sending me the documents. So, yeah.
Right.
I think
And
like the only steward that I actively know of, or like whenever I see the name, I'm like, okay, I know who this person is Johnny Herbert because he used to be a commentator. So I'm
Mhm,
like, okay, it's that at least I know like a face to the name. Have I ever spoken to this person? No, but I
mhm,
feel like at least I have some semblance of like this is who this human being is.
yeah.
Everyone else is kind of just like an anonymous talking head who doesn't even talk.
Exactly. And I wonder if you had like something similar to the way you have in really any sport that's not
Every sport,
motorsports. Yeah.
yes.
Just for genuinely any other sport that does not involve a car, you're gonna have a face and a voice that
Mhm,
go to your calls. And I do
mhm,
wonder if that would change kind of the sort of trustworthiness, so to speak, or perceived trustworthiness of the calls. Because I think also sometimes it's the other big difference in motorsports versus another like sort of in-game sport is that the penalties aren't instant. So
mhm,
because there's like noted or under investigation and then the
mhm.
penalty is finally done, and then for example we're currently still waiting for the results of some penalties which
I must
hopefully will
say,
come out.
investigated after the race annoys me. Give me
Yes.
a decision, especially when it happens at the start of the race. You have time.
Yep.
I will say that. That's my piece. I
Yeah.
must say that.
And I will say that also I think makes the sort of mentality the actually hilariously, the answer just came out to our
Oh,
question,
did it?
which yeah, which also makes our point a little bit more specific. 5K fine and reprimand for Norris for aborted start. Same
Oh,
for George, no action for Yuki, or Liam. So I
okay.
this actually hilariously timing
Wait,
is
and
very
oh, the Mercedes didn't get disqualified.
oh, did they not officially?
No, they just fines. They both got $5,000 fines.
So see, okay, here's the thing. That kind of brings up the it's gonna totally go against my trustworthiness point about the FIA. I think when they do
Hmm.
stuff like you're saying, where they say we're gonna investigate it after the race, and
Yeah.
then they make choices that could affect the overall championship fight,
Yeah.
the overall results, that's where people start to feel like, okay, you could have made the decision in race and allowed people to make, if they had come out with time penalties, it
Hmm.
sucks if you do that in race and you don't do that in the race and you don't allow them to try
Yes.
to catch up. And if you go with a fine instead of a time penalty, then it looks like preferential treatment. It looks like
Yes.
these different things. So
Yeah, and even in this doc, it says, given the unusual circumstances surrounding the compressed timetable aborted start, the grid access logistics, and given the stipulation from the technical directive, like blah, 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 like normally a breach of this nature with a competitive session would carry a sporting penalty, but it is not appropriate in this case. Like it very specifically says, like, it's just weird
yeah.
circumstances, which is why it's a fine. Otherwise, it would be more.
Yeah, and
Interesting.
I think what's interesting about that is it brings up again this difference between sporting regulations for Formula 1 and for other motorsports as well versus other sports.
Hmm.
The rules are usually just the rules. There's
Yeah.
no interpretation other than maybe in hockey you could talk about sort of like upgrading different levels of penalties, or in soccer same
Yeah.
thing, or football
Football,
depending
yeah.
on where you're from. But I think with like with basketball,
Mhm.
foul's a foul. You have a certain number of fouls to give.
Mhm.
You have the same penalty for every foul that's called, and whether you agree with the call or you don't, the punishment's the same.
Yes.
Versus there's this open to interpretation concept that Formula One just has hanging over it.
This is very American of me, but anytime I like there's anything where it's like, "Oh, this is open to interpretation," all I think of is the United States Constitution, and I'm like,
Mm.
"Are the are the F1 regulations a living, breathing document where we're supposed to interpret them based on the situation?" Technically, yes. And I'm like,
Yeah.
this is horrible where it's like, "Oh wow, my US history brain just like really loves talking about it like that way, because I'm like, wow, we really have to look at this thing and be like, how can we apply it to this situation? And you can apply it really conservatively or liberally. Like, we're basically the court system here.
Well, and I think you're right though. Like the Formula One sporting regulations and stewards and the FIA as a whole, it really is. It's a governing body. It's not
Yes.
a referee. Um,
Yes.
and I think that is. I think it does cause controversy between fans of what's right, what's not right.
Hmm.
But it does also give us interesting moves where like whereby certain things would be really hard to argue, right? So
Hmm.
like, okay, Lando has this weird false start situation today, and
Hmm.
if they decide to give him a 10-second penalty for it, and
Hmm.
that was just the rule, there is no open interpretation. Everybody who
Hmm.
was in the front three places and anybody who went off the line for this additional safety lap, now you have a 10-second penalty.
Yes.
If that's the case, then you have the same argument of like the flip side, which is if you get to the end and Lando's now lost more points and he loses the championship by those number of points, then there's always an asterisk next to the season of, well, if there hadn't been the rain, if it hadn't been
Yes.
confusing, if he hadn't had this. So it's so hard because I don't know that there's that one's necessarily better than the other, because
Hmm.
if you are open to interpretation, then you can say, okay, this call that we're about to make, it could change the overall fight for the championship and whether or not
Yes.
this sport is fair. Or if everything's exactly the same, then you don't have a conversation about whether there's bias or those types of things. So I don't know.
Right. It's very odd. And I think that the whole team order swap, I didn't really like. It's gonna be always a topic of conversation, but at the
Yeah.
same time, I'm just like, okay, just let it happen. It's clear who is in the championship battle and who isn't. So
Yeah.
we're gonna go forward with that. And then
Yeah. Oh, I before we move on from that on the team orders, the one thing I do actually really want to say is that I thought Lando in the post sprint press conference, and in a couple of other moments that were after the sprint with Oscar, I thought he actually did a very good job of trying to talk about the fact that Oscar had a great drive and that objectively he won. He did acknowledge that there was, team orders that they swapped, that it's not preferable to be in that type of situation, though they knew they would be. It does seem like that part of McLaren's drama of the year is over. It's settled. Everyone's doing their best. And I thought Lando did his best to basically be like, yeah, you know what, we're fighting for two championships. We all know that. I think the funny yeah, and the best was I don't know if you saw the clip, but a reporter asked or when the reporter started her question, she accidentally congratulated Oscar on his win. Um, and Oscar was sort of like, I don't know what I won, but thank you." And I thought it was sportsmanlike of Lando, as I do my best to be pretty balanced on these things. I've been critical of things that he's done this weekend, and I think also of a positive thing that I think was very sportsmanlike of him was to say to that reporter, he was like, "I'm almost glad that you did accidentally congratulate Oscar because he did. It's just an unfortunate situation that we're in, and nobody wants to win that way." Hmm. Yeah, 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 absolutely. And for me, I also think we have to acknowledge that it's what we've been asking McLaren to do. Like everyone has been so upset about this for so long and saying that McLaren doesn't understand that they're after a championship. They don't understand that Lando has this chance to do it. They're not prioritizing him. There has been an insane amount of discourse about that, and I think if we don't also acknowledge that they're doing it now, like I think it's a positive. Um,
yes.
it's their focus. They're locked in. They want it.
Yeah.
So
I think yeah, and I think that's what you have to do in terms of being a championship team. I think that they definitely had their like growing pains and
mhm.
their moments where they're like, what are we doing here? Like, I have no idea. But at least pre Grand Prix, they did a good job. Grand Prix,
Yes.
I have thoughts about their strategy, so we will talk about
Same.
that.
Yeah, well, let's get into the Grand Prix. Obviously, we know
Yes.
that we went through, you and I both stayed up for, or woke up, or went through a number of turns and twists, and no qualifying was to be had on Saturday.
Yeah.
Then this morning we get up for early qualification. I will be honest, I was sitting there on my phone looking at the weather, and I was like, thunderstorms? Am I a
It's
joke to you?
raining again.
Are we sure? But we started on time. We just
Mhm.
had quite a bit going on
Oh my,
there.
all the red flags.
Yes.
Too many red flags. I mean, the next race I can think of that was, like, somewhat comparable to this was Australia last year, which is, like,
Mm.
red flag, red flag, red but that was during the Grand Prix. This is just qualifying where everyone is just going off, and I was like,
Yeah.
"Of course it's gonna be Brazil, where it's raining,
Yeah.
and this just happens," and qualifying takes 2 hours to complete.
Yeah, and we had, I think, 5 crashes
Yes.
in qualifying.
Yeah,
I was particularly devastated for Franco, and
me
then
too.
more devastated for Alex too.
Yeah.
Um,
Alex
and
qualifying P7 and then
yes,
not being able to start the Grand Prix is heartbreaking. And I know people were saying like, "Oh, give him Franco's car," but I wasn't happy about the Australia decision with Logan to begin with. I would never want Williams to put any driver in that position ever again, even if Alex severely outqualified Franco.
yeah.
And I think that's just like an unfortunate situation that had to happen. But I
I
felt
also
really
think like
like his interview where he was like, when he was like, "Oh, I'm not racing today." I was like,
yeah.
"Oh, like that's
I
really
was
sad."
devastated for him. And it sucks because it's like, had that happened on the right time, they probably could have fixed the car they would have had enough time to fix the car
For
overnight.
sure.
He might have had to have taken,
Yeah.
a penalty or these different things. But
Yeah.
I agree. I think one thing I really think showed this weekend is that some teams have really learned from their mistakes earlier in the year. And I do think that in Brazil, where reportedly like every flight from Argentina to Brazil was sold out,
Mhm.
there were 50 busloads of people who drove 30 hours to see Franco drive. I think it would have been a very wrong move from Williams to take Franco out of the race, even
Definitely.
though he ended up not completing the race anyway. I think they've learned a little bit more from the mistakes. And when I say mistakes, I mean they were strategy calls, but they were bad PR, if that makes
Yeah,
sense. Um, and it- I think they've learned a little bit from that, and they've made better decisions. So
definitely. And I think Williams has definitely grown as a team. Like Franco has been competing very well. Alex has been competitive as well. And I know people want to give Alex a lot of flack because of things that have happened, some of which are out of his control. But I think that they've definitely been more competitive this season than they have in a lot of other seasons. And I think Franco coming in, even if I wasn't happy with the driver swap decision to begin with, it was definitely the right call now. And like he's so beloved and
yeah,
it was very cool to see in like a place that is so close to his hometown or as close
yeah,
to his hometown as we're ever gonna
as you
get.
can get, yeah, yeah. And I thought it was really awesome to see like someone so young
Mhm.
and so new to the sport
Yeah.
really receiving that level
Yeah.
of support. And it's always fun to watch, like, I think watching Franco and Lewis.
Mhm.
And one of the big points that actually have gotten, because of how chaotic the weekend was, I think we
Mhm.
like rushed past it really fast. Franco had like I can't, like, the dream press conference with Lewis Hamilton, because he's spoken so much about how big of an influence and hero
Yeah.
Lewis was. And the first race that he had where Lewis came and congratulated him, he like posted the cutest screenshot of it to his Instagram, like clearly just a fanboy, so happy about it. And I cannot imagine what it would feel like to sit next to Lewis Hamilton and have Lewis say, not only has he earned his right to be in
Mhm.
Formula One, there are 2 seats still available. And if I were
Yeah.
you, I would do anything in my like
Yeah.
power to make that seat my own. And then right behind that, you have Max saying in a press conference, like, it's a complicated situation, but I think he's more than earned his seat. And I know
Yeah.
multiple teams want him. So whatever the team decides to do is good for him. And making it very clear he'd be happy to have him as his teammate. I There's no way I would ever shut up. I would literally just be like texting clips of that to my friends, anyone who's ever wronged me. I would literally be like, you suck. Any teacher that ever wrote like something about your potential not being realized, that clip would go everywhere if I were
Yes.
Franco.
Oh, for sure. And it's like the reality is like Franco, like these younger drivers grew up with the like Lewis Hamilton
Yeah.
era of driving. So like he's like just as much of like goat status to them in their brain. Like Max is relatively newer, so I think like the next generation of F1 drivers that come in are going to be like very much like, oh my gosh, we saw Max and Lando, like, and
Yeah.
what if they stay in the sport for long enough, they are going to have that same kind of realization. But it's like it's so cool, and I think it's
Yeah.
so special, and I love it. It makes me like, me as a fan is so happy to see that, because you can tell not only is he a professional race car driver, he is just as much of a fan.
Those are my favorite moments in this sport, are like, because of how long you can compete in it, there are
Mhm.
these generational talents that are now
Yeah.
interacting with like people who are Gen Z drivers that are,
Mhm.
you have all of these, and it's actually happened with Lewis with the last round of drivers that came in as
Mhm.
well. But you have like pictures of George Russell like peeking out to see Lewis behind behind the
Mhm.
garage, or
Yeah.
you have clips of them like having shown up to the track to get something signed, and now
Yeah.
they're racing on the same grid, and it
Yeah.
like makes me emotional a little bit.
Yeah. I'm like, and like, I think like the example that always makes me super emotional is like Seb and Schumacher, which is like way back,
Yeah.
like, but I'm like, oh my gosh, like my whole heart will always be so happy that like they were able to race together in Formula One.
Yeah, it's really beautiful, and I also just like the amount of confidence that you must have as a
Oh
boost,
yeah.
even though Franco obviously had a rough weekend and it just wasn't,
Yeah.
the most ideal
Yeah.
performance in the end, but like going home and being able to say to your team, "Hey, Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen basically wrote me like the best
The best.
recommendation letter in the world."
Oh yeah. It's beautiful. It's perfect. I'm so happy for him. Again, not the most ideal race weekend for
Yeah.
him. For a lot of drivers, honestly, like just seeing each one of them during qualifying in the race, just like whoop, like it'd be a
Yeah.
different person every like 5 minutes. It'd just be like someone went off, another yellow flag. What's going
Yeah.
on here? Like it was never anything where there was any sense of normalcy or consistency. It was just always chaos.
Yeah. Also, I think like I was sitting there at the end of Q3
Hmm.
screaming. Like I was like, I don't know what's gonna happen. I was gasping, I was shouting, and when Yuki ended up for a second he was P2, and then when he was P3, I was
Yes.
like, is this real? This is real life? It
Because
is.
when Liam went to P2 at
Mhm.
first, I was like, oh my gosh. And then
Yeah.
Yuki was improving, and I was like, oh my gosh. And then I remember I texted you, and I was
Yeah.
like, what are we going to do? Because I was like, I also texted someone else, and I was like, I am manifesting. I'm manifesting a Yuki Tsunoda win. If we got a Yuki
Yes.
Tsunoda win today, I think I would be still in tears now.
Same. I don't think I would be well in any way, shape, or form. But I was manifesting it. I was like,
Yeah.
everybody needs to focus. I when after qualifying, I posted it on my story and I was like, we all need to start right now. Everyone needs to light a candle, anything. So I would have loved to have seen that, but yeah, I obviously that's not what ended up happening. But I was really proud of Yuki and Liam,
Yeah.
to be honest. Both of them
Oh
did
yeah.
a great job.
P3,
Um,
P5, Liam, like in the circumstances where he came back, Yuki just like driving some of the best drives that he's ever had this
mhm.
season. Good for them. Honestly, I'm very happy that they're in the position that they were able to do this.
Same. Which also is important for us to note that Lando was on pole, and then you have George in second, Yuki in third. And then you also have Max not qualify well. Both the Red Bulls are down. And Max then also takes a 5 grid penalty, which puts him at P17 for the start of the race. And Lewis gets knocked out in Q1 and is at 16. So,
Crazy shock. That I think that's
yeah.
what I was like, do I watch the rest of this? Because what do you mean? I all I want ever is for Lewis Hamilton to do well.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm super biased, but this is just a track that I assume he's always going to do well at. So seeing that, I was like, is it worth watching the rest of qualifying? Obviously, we watched the rest of qualifying, but there were definitely lots of shocks. Both
Yeah.
Red Bulls getting out in Q2 is definitely very surprising. I think more so Max than Checo, because Checo hasn't had the most glorifying record in qualifying this season.
Yeah.
But both of them getting knocked out in Q2 is definitely a shock.
Yeah. Oh, one thing I did want to point out in defense of Checo, because after sprint qualifying, I saw so many people really ragging on him and saying, it's just outrageous that he still has a seat. And other performance issues like aside, the one specific thing I did want to point out about sprint
Mhm.
qualifying, this is not for the Grand Prix, just to be clear, but
Mhm.
for sprint, Red Bull sent him out with not enough time to do
Yes.
a full lap. And so that was not like him getting knocked out was actually a bad team strategy
Yeah.
call,
Oh,
not necessarily his inability.
even for qualifying, they
Yeah.
let him like go sit out in the pit lane and like when especially in these wet weather conditions, it's better to go out last because the
Mm.
tires are going to like brush through the water away and all of that stuff. They could have kept him in the garage for longer and they
Yeah.
didn't. So I think that that was also, and he was mad about it too, and his radio was very clear about that. I do think that like he could have had a better qualifying because he did, if I'm not mistaken, he did really well in Q1, and that I think should have set him up, or the team should have set him up better. I'm surprised. I think that was one of Red Bull's flaws this weekend was
Mhm.
how they set their cars up for like these qualifying sessions because I think it's clear that like there was just a little bit of misalignment there, which
Yeah.
happens sometimes.
Yeah, agreed. But yeah, I think sometimes the narrative can get so pile on because he,
Yeah,
to be fair, has not been performing well. And so it's
definitely.
a real conversation to be having. And there's also lots of rumors floating around, blah, blah, blah. But
There's always rumors, isn't there? That Red Bull seat is never secure.
never ever. There's always an exit clause and it's always performance based. And to be fair, his performance has not been great. But I did want to point out that sometimes it actually this weekend was the race itself, I can't help him with that. But
Yeah.
the actual qualifying of both cases, I think was
Yeah.
important to point out. The other big moment that we haven't spoken about yet that is a bit of a surprise was that Ollie Behrman had to take over for Kevin Magnussen this weekend.
Yes. Crazy shock.
Yeah, which also, fun or not so fun fact, because he's now done 3 full Grand Prix weekends, he no longer can be part of the rookie test, which
Yeah.
kind of is a
Which,
bummer.
yeah, I guess there are pros and cons. He is probably one of the reserve drivers who has had the most experience in Grand Prix racing before having a full-time race seat, which is
Yeah,
great for him. I think that's super important, especially given that 2 of those races are in the car that he is going to be racing next year.
yeah,
That's very important. Having that experience is great for him. But it does put Haas in a weird position going into this rookie test since now if they want both Esteban and Ollie to be part of that test, they're going to have to split their time. And
yeah,
I think that maybe Ollie does have more experience in that car. So maybe they'll factor that in. But also, it'd be good for both of them to have equal time at the end of Abu Dhabi just to figure it out for next season. They're both going to be driving that car. I do wonder who's going to be in that second seat, though. I'm like, or in the rookie seat.
yeah.
There's lots of questions because Ferrari no longer has access to Ollie Behrman. The next Ferrari driver who's like in the FDA lineup, I believe, is in F3.
Oh,
So yeah, I really
I
don't
actually
know who
don't
they're gonna
know
put
off the
instead.
top of my
I
head,
think
yeah.
I believe it's Dino. I
Mhm.
don't remember his last name. I apologize. But from what I read correct or if I might be wrong, but I think he's the next person in line technically to like work his way up the Ferrari ladder.
Would it not be Arthur? Um,
No,
Leclerc?
I don't think so. I don't
No,
because he's not competing in single seaters anymore.
that's true. I just know he's still in the
He
academy,
is.
and they've done
Yes.
some stuff, but I guess a lot of that's just about the Charles of it all, but I think yeah, I don't know. I actually don't know. I guess maybe
Yeah.
that's
So
right.
I do wonder because usually it's like Ferrari is running into that issue. Haas will also have a similar issue now because they do need to run someone for their rookie test. So
Yeah.
we'll see who they pull up. Maybe because who was it? I don't know if like Fittipaldi would still be a candidate. I don't
Yeah.
remember how many Grand Prix he raced in 2020 when he took over for Roma, but like
I'm actually not
maybe
sure.
he's still there. Robert Schwartzman still exists as well, so maybe he's going to be in that seat. There
Yeah.
are definitely people around. I just wonder how they're going to game plan that.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see because obviously I'm sure they had no intention of not running Ollie. So It'll
Yeah.
be, like you said, it presents a different issue as they have 2 new drivers next year, and they also, now one of them isn't a rookie. Is
Hmm.
technically not classified as a rookie anymore, so
Yes.
it'll be interesting. But also, unfortunately for him, he's one of 5 DNFs of the race. Poor guy.
I cannot believe there were so many DNA. I think just like seeing them. I mean, the first one, Lance Stroll, or technically Alex Albon, who didn't even start,
Yeah.
but first one, Lance Stroll, on the formation lap, just like completely caught out.
Okay. This was actually I always ask, if you're listening to the podcast also and you haven't done this, I always ask if people have questions before we record, both on my Instagram story and in the Grid Chat Discord, which you can join in the episode description. However, one of the questions was why did Lance drive into the gravel? Which I wish I had an answer for you,
Yeah.
because there's literally no reason he should have done that. I am sure it was something with the car, with the rain, with the wet conditions that made him kind of go off of track during a
Yeah.
formation lap. But why he chose to turn around and drive
Beach
directly in?
himself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I they didn't really show footage of it. They just
Yeah.
showed that he was beached, but I have quite literally no idea what happened there, because he was on pavement. He actually could have re-entered the track and done the race. So I'm
Yeah.
very unclear actually as to what that was.
Yeah, and I didn't go back to, like, look because it wasn't, I guess, top of mind, but the fact that they aborted the start tells
Mhm.
us that it was in, like, or his car was in a place where it couldn't be recovered without the crane and all of that stuff
Yeah,
coming in. He could not retrieve the car on his own, so in that way, I don't know. I really don't know. I wonder. And now
unclear.
I want to know now.
No, I would love to know. Like, I wish I had a proper answer. I do think that obviously driver error in some capacity, because he's not in the gravel and then suddenly which he has a drivable car, which he then drove
Mhm.
into the gravel. So unclear, but it
Yeah.
did cause problems. So
Yes.
I guess maybe he just
Yeah.
didn't feel like racing. You know what I mean? Maybe it
We
was
an
you
off
want to
day.
call in sick and you're just like, like, that's that's the energy it gave for me, unfortunately.
But
Um,
aborted start, and then
yeah.
we had that start infringement from 4 of the drivers.
Yeah, so you
Uh,
have the aborted start, which also I
mhm,
wanted to explain this in case, because some
yeah,
people did ask about what exactly
mhm,
happened. So
yes,
you have your formation lap,
mhm,
which everybody knows happens every race. You do a little lap, you come back, and you park in your grid spot. You must park in your grid spot, as we found out from Checo last weekend. You cannot park in front nor behind. You must start
mhm,
where you belong.
yes,
So everybody comes over, but then during that formation lap, because Lance beached himself in the gravel, we have what's called an aborted start, which at that point is different on the actual screen of what the drivers are seeing. It
mhm,
says aborted start as opposed to formation lap,
mhm,
and the lights go on as well. And so from there, they are supposed to turn off their car and sit still, and we're basically just going to start all over. Guys are going to come back on the grid. It's just like we
mhm,
never did a formation lap at all,
yeah,
because the reason why you have an aborted start is because that there is a car that, like you said, can't be cleared without the crane, and that there are going to be people on track. There's a dangerous situation. Obviously, they do not want cars on the track zooming. And so because we saw Lando go first, followed by, I believe, George, Yuki,
mhm,
Liam also, I believe,
yeah,
did do a lap.
yeah,
So all 5 of those drivers were then noted, which was then, like you said, not going to be resolved until post race, which
yeah,
is troublesome because no one knows what that actually means in terms of penalty. They can't make their decisions based off of that.
mhm,
And there was some argument back and forth about, like, Lando was the one who made everybody like follow him doing that. So does Lando take the penalty and no one else does, or
mhm,
does the whole grid basically, except for like a couple of people, get a penalty?
mhm.
Um, but ultimately, we now know it was a fine and a reprimand.
Yeah. And they're going to have to be consistent with that going forward. If like
Yeah.
the same thing happens again, like at least teams now know that it should be the same situation unless something excessively dangerous happens.
Mhm.
But definitely a weird moment where it was like, oh, these drivers went around again. You were like, huh. I was like, What's happening here?" Because I think I texted someone. I was like, "What's going on? I don't
Yeah, I
understand.
was
Didn't they
like, why
abort the
are we
start?"
doing a second lap? Are we are we just feeling
Because
Okay.
sometimes there is a second formation lap.
Yeah.
Sometimes something does happen and they will be like, okay, let's do another one.
Yeah.
Usually that happens when it's raining and they're like, okay, let's like kind of delay a little bit. But this was not that. This
Yeah.
was like aborted start, team comes back on the grid, tires go back in blankets kind of situation. So definitely an odd series of events. Didn't really amount to anything significant. So that's
Yeah.
good news.
I will say also the only other part of that that could have been a factor in the race was that Carlos Sainz, I believe it was, started from the pit lane. And so
Hmm.
with an aborted start, it means he's sitting with the engine running, no
Yeah.
more, like he can't keep it kind of cooled down because he's not running air through the car.
Yeah.
And so that's also not necessarily the reason that he didn't finish, but it is still a
Hmm.
factor in the race for sure.
Definitely. Yeah. I
Yeah.
think I pit lane starts always kind of scare me. I'm
Yeah.
not even gonna lie, because they're only allowed to go after the cars all kind of come past them.
Hmm.
So the way that it happens is it can be very dangerous
Yeah.
in like the car's condition because tires aren't warm or anything like that. At least all the drivers who are on the grid have done that formation lap, so their tires have like at least this much warmth.
Hmm.
Sitting there like that, kind of terrifying. Cold tires are
Yeah.
just terrifying, is what it is.
Agreed. Cold tires in the rain in an already chaotic race while you're sitting waiting is just
Hmm.
across the board not great.
Yeah,
So I felt for him.
yeah,
But yeah. So then this race is so chaotic that I think we can just talk about a couple of different race stories with people.
yes.
Um, Obviously, the big story of the day is Max. We have a P17 to a race win, which there's whether you like or dislike Max, you cannot deny that that was an incredibly skillful drive.
Such a masterclass. His first Grand Prix win since June, which
Mhm.
is a long time, given
Yeah.
that Max Verstappen won 19 of 23 Grand Prix last year. But this was probably, again, I said this earlier, probably one of my favorite Max wins. It was very skillful, making up, I think, 10 places in the first two laps in wet weather conditions. Like, Max knows how to drive in the wet. We have known that, but that is just incredibly skillful, masterful driving.
Yeah, agreed. And I think like you can even tell based off of how some of the drivers responded. Like you have Lewis Hamilton posting on Max's Instagram, which is like
Crazy.
that's a sentence. Can you imagine like saying that in 2021? Like
Oh
Lewis
no.
Hamilton commented on Max's Instagram, mega drive. Like, sorry?
Like my whole heart, because I'm not like I've never been like a like avid Max fan,
Yeah.
like because I am a Lewis fan, but I must say like that made me so excited. And this year I think I've become more of a Max fan because of the competitiveness aspect, like all over again
Yeah.
with a driver who is Lewis. Um, so I think that that has made me like enjoy Max's drives more. And given that he has a little bit more competition, but yes, that the comment made me really happy. Very,
I
very
was
happy.
I was like it was one of those things where I was like, I don't even know that it's about like, oh, their bad blood is solved, though they have
Yeah,
been ironically a little bit more supportive of each other this year
definitely.
in an interesting way, I think. But so and like you specifically saw that when Max was caught out with the community service thing, and Lewis was like,
Mhm.
not only would I not do it, I don't think Max should do it either. I was like, oh, um,
Support
period.
besties.
Defend your friend. I guess defend your enemy, whatever you want.
Yeah.
So I've been surprised by their camaraderie, I guess I would say this year, and it's
Yes,
easier, of course, to have camaraderie when you're not directly competing with each other,
definitely.
100%. And so I think you've seen a little bit of that, and I think part of that it really is actually Max maturing over the last couple
Oh,
of
for
years,
sure.
and so it's nice. And then you see sort of like I saw that comment, and I was like, okay, you know what? This is like one of the things that you have to acknowledge is the drive was so good that someone who still genuinely feels a championship was taken away from him unfairly and has talked about this in interviews this year and agreed and said like in his GQ profile was basically like, yeah, I still feel like that was my win and I still feel like it was unfair. Um,
Yeah.
that much tension between the two of them. And you also have Lewis, like I said 2 races ago, acknowledging, like saying, "Oh yeah, now you guys want to talk about Max's dangerous driving after I had to
Yeah.
deal with it. There is tension between the two of them.
Oh, for sure.
For Lewis to sit down and be like, "Great job." You have to
You did
acknowledge
good.
that that was an incredible drive.
Yes.
Beautiful, beautiful work.
Yeah. The other story that I was like, okay, Max, we love that drive. The Alpines.
I
I
am
need
so
I'm
proud of
in
them.
I'm on the floor. I was like, are you kidding me right now? Because one, strategy, A plus. Or
Yeah.
even Red Bull strategy. Both Alpine and Max's strategy
Yeah.
was the same and it was correct. Like that was the way to go. And I am wildly impressed by the decisions made because there were people like Ollie Behrman was like, I'm trying not to die here. There are people who are literally actively trying to stay on track because everywhere they're going is like not the racetrack. The white lines are slick. People are going off. Lewis Hamilton can't even drive straight. Like it was insanity to
Mhm.
see. And like there was a moment, like I think it was when Charles pitted right before the virtual safety car, where Charles pits to go on to a new set of inters. And then there was this debate of new set of inters or wet weather
Mm.
tires. And a majority of the people went, because the rain was increasing, majority of the people went new set of inters. Some people went wet weather. I think it was like Yuki, Liam, and someone else went wet weather. The Alpines and Max stayed out.
Mhm.
What a decision to make
Yeah.
in dangerous conditions.
Exactly. And I think this is something that we're seeing a conversation about now with this idea of luck. And I uh it's not just a Lando comment. Lando did make this comment about saying that which I didn't love the comment, but he made this comment saying that it was luck, not talent, for that
Mhm.
specific situation that cars were able to change their tires under a safety car.
Mhm.
I mean, under a red flag. Excuse me.
Mhm.
And with that being said, obviously it it does, I think, take away from the strategy of knowing to stay out and calculating risk.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of Formula 1 is about taking that information, taking that data and making that call. And part of what makes you recognize that it was a call, not just luck. And sure, everything to be frank, anybody who can go outside for 2 hours and drive at 200 miles an hour and not crash and not
Mhm.
die, they have a little bit of luck involved. There is
Yeah.
luck involved in going out for a
Oh,
race.
for sure.
But to say that strategy like this, which I think is about calculating risk and making decisions, there's a certain amount of possibility that there is going to be a red flag, given the fact that we have had multiple cars crash in qualifying, given the fact that we started under an aborted start, and given the fact that the track is getting more and more dangerous. It's a
Mhm.
calculated risk, which is a strategy call, and it's the
Mhm.
right strategy call. And the other reason you know that is because George himself was very upset that they made the opposing strategy call, which was to come in and
Mhm.
change the tires. Um, and so I personally, I don't think it's luck in so much as anything else that happens in a Formula One race is luck.
Oh, for sure. And I think like there's a whole strategy team. There's so much data coming in. You'll see these things where it's like, oh, there's 100% chance of a safety car at some races because in the past there's always been a safety car. And we've seen over the last couple of races that hasn't necessarily been true
Mhm.
because Burt Mylander is just like hasn't really had to do much, at least until uh Austin, right? Where they had to
Yeah.
bring out the safety car for the first time since Canada. The reality of the situation is strategy includes a lot of data, a lot of chance, a lot of probability. Like there's a lot of factors that go into this.
Mhm.
And the weather in Brazil was very conducive to a lot of things going wrong. I think that you can also look at things like, I don't know, Silverstone, Miami.
Yeah.
Safety cars happen. Weird things will happen. You can never know exactly what's going to happen next. And you have to sometimes just stay out for that little bit longer, make that calculated risk of, oh, is it right to go from like slicks to wets? Is it the right move to pit at all? All of these things need to happen at the right time. And sometimes it is like you made the right call. I wouldn't say there is always an element of luck, but it
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily mean it's all luck because the
Agreed.
strategy teams have to make that call. And I think that that's a very smart thing. I think one of the commentators was saying like, oh, to go on to like the full wets or like on a new set of inters, that's going to be fully the driver's call because they're the only ones who know what the conditions are on the track. And I think that's exactly like that was part of it.
Mhm.
But when you're going to a new set of inters, I think it's a whole different story
Agreed.
because it's the same tire, you just might have like that much more grip. So yeah, I think I would not call that luck. I would say that's just it's a calculated risk is
Mhm.
really what it is, because it's probably more dangerous to stay out the way that they did. And the
Yeah.
fact that they were able to bring it home and stay so stable for that long, A plus. Good job.
Agreed. And it's like that's what I think you're pointing out one of the best parts of Formula 1, which is that I think also gets forgotten a lot. It's not all about the drivers. The drivers are just the
Mhm.
ones that you're seeing. And so
Yeah.
it is a conversation back and forth where you also had Lando saying, think about a new set of inters, and the
Mhm.
strategy team saying, we'd really like to stay out if you can.
Yes.
That's them calculating that risk and
Yeah.
determining, listen, there's a like 98% chance we're going to get a red flag. And
Mhm.
if we don't, like we've seen in other races this season where everyone has, hoped for a safety car. So when you look back and you look at Singapore, that's a strategy call that actually didn't work out, where everybody
Mhm.
was calculating for a safety car or for a
Mhm.
red flag. And because they didn't get one, that was a problem for their strategy. And for people who did
Mhm.
not account for a safety car or a red flag, they had a better strategy. Um,
Yes.
and so I think it's an imbalance to say, just because this is maybe a more dramatic version of it because of the rain and because of the danger, it's
Mhm.
unfair to say that it wasn't the team behind. Like there are engineers, there are strategists
Yeah.
that are sitting there reading data and making these calls. And I
Yeah.
don't think we give them enough credit. And I also think it sucks to debase their work to just call it luck.
Yeah, it's probably honestly, the strategy is probably my favorite part of this entire sport. Like, oh
Yeah.
my goodness. I'm also we're both really tech nerds.
Yeah.
So having the ability to like consume all of that data and then make a call within a split second is incredible. Like that is
Yeah.
the coolest thing ever. And I'm like, I would not call that luck. That is
No.
just making making a decision at the right time based on a bunch of information that you have. And sometimes you need like it just works out and sometimes it doesn't. Like that Ferrari call to call Charles in, it ended up working out in the end because
Yeah.
of how the whole like safety car situation played in. So he was able to kind of get back to where he was on track. But in the moment, horrible call. Like, why
Yeah.
would they do that?
Horrible call. Horrible call. And I literally, when they said it, I was like, why? What? Why? Um, and again, it's like, that's the thing though. It's like there are hundreds of people on a Formula One team, and every single
Mhm.
one of them does something to make a win or a loss possible. And I think
Yes.
when we look at that, we should remember how many people are involved, and also the amount of data that you are
Yeah.
crunching as a human being. That is just such a skill set that can't even be really
I
described.
wish if anyone wants to bring Marissa and I in to just like stare at data for hours on end during a race, we will happily do that. I'm not even
Yes.
joking.
Honestly, also, very much so, anybody who is, like, listening and is like, "I'm one of those engineering people that can explain these things," I would love to talk to you. I would love to have you on and talk about that, because I really think we just don't have, I think actually we're getting a little bit more of it with Ruth Buscombe and, Bernie
Bernie
Collins
Collins,
being
yes.
commentators. We're getting a little bit more of that understanding,
Mhm.
but I don't think we talk about
We
that
don't.
part of the sport enough as fans. And I also would recommend anybody who's like on the side of, oh, it's just luck. If you have not read Bernie Collins's book yet, I think it's really helpful to see sort of like the mentality and the sort of journey of becoming a race strategist and understanding this amount of information. So if anyone is listening and wants to literally just let me and Neha understand and listen to you talk about math and data, I promise you we are available.
We will happily pick your brain for multiple hours if possible. Not multiple hours, but we would.
Anything, however much time you personally want to feel like someone's listening to you, you have willing parties right here. So days, hours, years, I don't know,
Uh,
but we're
I
available.
don't know. Give us a job? I don't know.
Sure, I don't know. I don't know. If you have numbers, we know how to read them. Um,
Us and our,
um,
like, technical math brains just being like, "Woo."
it's so bad because I'm like, I feel myself every time certain comments are made, whether it's online or like fandom or a driver, or and sometimes those are just made in the heat of the moment in
Mhm.
response. But I think I have just like a tension where I'm like, the unsung heroes of this sport are the people who are sitting in front of a computer, screaming and looking at math and being expected to make a decision within a
Oh
split
yeah.
second.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
and then when you're giving that information and being told no, like that's the worst part about it as well. And then on top of all of that, if you're right, nobody wants to give you credit. And if you're wrong, people suddenly remember that
Hate
it's
on
all
you.
your fault.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I feel very pro data team. So
Yes. I
that's how I feel.
if like it's like the data team, the race engineers, if I
Yeah.
could talk to them for hours on end, I happily would. Like one person I would love to talk to just for like experience wise
Mm.
is Bono because he's been through it all with
Yeah.
Lewis. And I'm like, that's such a cool relationship to have with someone where it's like you have gone through all the ebbs and flows, multiple wins, and then like maybe 2016 and 2021 being like these like losses, which are like probably hurt very like a lot, but
Yeah.
not just for Lewis as a driver, but for him as like the one person in communication with Lewis at all times. I have so many questions.
Yeah, I just can't I mean, I can't imagine. And
Yeah.
the one thing I will say that I really hope this conversation might help if you are like you're younger, you're in high school or you're in college and you're trying to figure out like you actually enjoy math and you don't know what that means for yourself. I hope that you at least find out that these are really cool jobs that you could have. Like
Yes.
you could have a lifelong relationship with a Formula One driver, helping him win things or helping her win things and
Yeah.
crunching data and being a part of that because I
Yeah.
wish that had been told to me when I was
Oh,
in a younger.
same. Learning that James Vowles has a computer science degree, I'm like, we are the same.
Yeah.
We are the same.
Yeah, I'm like I feel like if we could find a way to let everyone know like there are other jobs other than just like mathematician or engineer, like there are different types of
Yeah.
engineering. I wish I had known much more about that at the time.
Yes.
So
100%.
I think we have very much deviated from the race to talk about how much we love math. So if anyone
Yes.
is
Sorry.
feeling sad about that, don't worry. We are back to Cargo Fest. Um, the other thing we should talk about actually is I want to talk a little bit about the Checo and Liam Lawson situation
Oh my
because
goodness.
yeah, I feel pretty much that sums it up. um, uh,
They've been
yeah.
like that's the best way to describe it. Just they're terrorizing each other,
Mhm.
whether it's like on purpose or on accident. They just always seem to just end up right next to each other.
Yeah, and what's interesting is I think we're seeing Liam drive to prove that he's a better driver than Checo, but in
Mhm.
some capacity now, two races in a row, we've seen contact come from that. And
Mhm.
um Liam's move against Checo in this weekend's race also is the thing that kept Checo out of the points. Um
Mhm.
and that's obviously troublesome for the overall constructors championship. Um,
Mhm.
but I also wonder how you feel. I think there's a large point of debate about the fact that like that shouldn't matter because they're two separate teams and Red Bull is able to
Mhm.
have those decisions and say, you know, dangle this Red Bull seat in front of someone else and hope that that means that they'll drive properly and
Mhm.
also be able to say like, oh, move out of the way so that Max can move forward or move quickly up the grid. And so I know it's a very controversial point, not illegal, but
Mhm.
controversial.
Yeah. I do have lots of thoughts on
Mhm.
the Red Bull slash AlphaTauri, Toro Rosso, RB, B carb, whatever they're calling it next year of it all. I think the reality of the situation is like I guess I ranted to someone about this, and then I guess the thesis statement that came out of my rant was something along the lines of the conversion rate from the junior team, the V Carb Toro Rosso team to the Red Bull team is not as high as it should be. And
Okay.
I think that all stems from like before, I'd say like when the team was bought by Red Bull, Toro Rosso kind of came to the grid as Toro Rosso in 2006, 2007 time frame. And since then, we had like Sebastian Vettel come through
Mhm.
as like the golden child. But there's always been that like the other seat is very rotational and the whole Red Bull that's just been the nature of it. They've done mid-season swaps since forever. They've been doing this. It's not abnormal. But Sebastian Vettel, Daniel Ricciardo, Max Verstappen, Pierre Gasly, and Alex Albon have been the kind of like 5 that have emerged. Pierre Gasly and Alex Albon have unfortunately not been able to kind of see that longevity.
Mhm.
But when we look at it like this, it's like they're kind of, there's, since then, that was in 2019. 2020, when they recruited Checo to the team, it's been almost 4 full seasons of a consistent non-Red Bull Junior Academy driver in the second Red Bull seat.
Yeah.
But they continuously dangle the second Red Bull seat as some prize to be won, even though there has been no, like, here is the prize at the end of the rainbow for anyone who has come through. Yuki has been there for long enough. Pierre was there for long enough. Now it's Daniel went back. Liam, like, you can see that there is an obvious, like, here is the prize, but no one is getting it. So I seriously wonder, like, what is happening with the Red Bull junior team program situation, because it is a junior team. As much as they want to market it as a sister team, it's a junior team. And it's clear. It's so clear now.
I think what's hard, what I struggle with is I agree, right? I think that if you're going to have a junior team, if you're going to have this possibility of moving up, then you would hope that someone would actually accomplish that. But what's hard is that there's so many factors as to why they haven't made the change yet, right? Like, did Daniel Ricciardo prove that he could drive at the level that he needed to come back after his sort of sojourn of leaving and finding himself? Did, like, objectively, Red Bull doesn't think so because they didn't keep him on the junior team. Even so, you have that. Then you also have Yuki. I think this year there's been a really big argument for his maturity having gotten high enough to potentially be considered for that seat. But I also know that there's complications with the fact that he's kind of connected to Honda. Honda's leaving next, or in 2026. There are so many arguments that could go back and forth. Pierre and Alex, depends on how you feel, were given a shot. I don't know that they were given long enough of a shot for them to really.
I personally, I think Alex was put into the seat way too early. That's my personal opinion. But I think at the end of the day, when we look at it, it's like, I don't think that anything that either team does should affect the other team.
Yes.
And there was a comment made, or was it during the sprint, was when Liam was like, was that Checo or was that Max? Like, he said something along those lines. And it was Checo, but they were like, no, don't worry about it. Just like keep going. And I think it was like also just to kind of like mitigate any bad blood situation, or maybe it just was like, kind of keep your head down, keep driving. But I do think that there hasn't been since, even, I don't think Singapore was that. I do not. I think that was like a give Daniel a shot kind of moment.
Agreed.
But at the same time, I'm still like, there shouldn't be any interference. I think that they should be running as 2 separate entities, even if they are sharing 4 drivers.
I think that's fair. And then I think, that being said, but separate from that as the assumption, given that they don't run that way and they do run as sort of a senior team and a junior team, Liam is very clearly openly fighting for that second seat.
Yes.
And I struggle to see them giving him that second seat when he is actively causing damage to Red Bull's current chances in the way that he is driving with Checo. Because today's contact I was surprised by it. I thought it was a little aggressive and not the best move. And especially in the dangerous conditions, could have potentially have been much worse than just a little bit of contact.
Yes.
And we know, obviously, last week he caused a large amount of damage to Checo's car.
It's all very, I want to see what happens over the next 3 races. I want to see if there's a big shift, because obviously this triple header was Liam's first 3 races back in this car. And I think that last year when he was in the car, it was under very different circumstances. It was like, here is like a couple of potential moments that you have to potentially be in the seat in the future, because Daniel doesn't have the opportunity or can't be here right now. Now it's like, this is your seat for 6 races. Do what you can with it. Do I think he can get this second RB seat for next year? Sure. I think it's definitely a possibility. Do I think that if he, and I do agree with you, I think that if he is actively harming Red Bull in the Constructors' Championship, though I don't think they actually want to win the Constructors' Championship this year.
Yeah.
That's a whole other tangent I could go on, but I don't think they want to win this year. And so I don't think like 1 point, couple points here and there would actually change anything. But I do think they're going to want to play some kind of 2-team game.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's hard where it's like I agree with you. I think they've sort of given up at least. I think they went in with the intention of winning the Constructors' Championship, and I think the way things
Yes.
have gone now, it's not necessarily. I think their focus now is keeping Max's WTC than over winning the Constructors' Championship.
Yeah.
However, I do think like if someone calls you in from last week's, if Christian Horner calls you in and is basically like, hey, maybe don't hit our other cars while you're on
Yeah.
track, and then the next week you do the same
You do
thing.
it. Yeah.
It's it's not so much about junior team versus senior team. It's more about
Yeah.
like, are you going to follow instructions? Like,
Yeah.
this is a concern in terms of the way that you're going to drive next
Yeah.
year if we promote you.
And along those lines, we did see a video of Christian Horner leaving the Williams hospitality and potential conversations surrounding, as we mentioned before, Franco Colapinto. How do we feel about that?
I feel like I know James said that he just wanted to share some coffee with Christian from a new coffee sponsor, which I will say very brilliant move from James because I
Oh
thought it
yeah.
was so tongue in cheek. You got your sponsor a little bit. You got like the sponsor's name was in every article about it. Very funny. Much bigger upgrade from the way he was talking about the rumors with Carlos. I'm impressed. We've made
Yes.
changes. We are back to a
It
more fun
sounded like he
personality.
was dating Carlos, like, or
It
he
really
was
did.
like really trying to get
Yeah.
a date with Carlos, which, you know what? If that's how, like, that's how that whole situation worked out. This was really fun. I thought it was like really, it was so like adorable the way that he
Yeah.
talked about it. Cause I was like, oh my gosh, like that is very clever to
Yeah.
deflect, but obviously that's not the conversation that was happening.
No, of course not. Over coffee, they were talking about one driver and his availability. And
Yes.
me personally, I was surprised. What I will say I was surprised by, but then after kind of thinking through the Liam of it all and the way that things have gone over the last couple of races, which again is not necessarily a fair assessment for him. He only has 5 races to be able to make that kind of move for himself and
Hmm.
prove that he deserves to be here and that he can be a good team player. So
Yeah.
I don't know that 5 races is a fair assessment of his driver capabilities or of his attitude or anything like that. Um, However, I will say what I was surprised by was I thought the rumors were about Franco taking a V carb seat and then one of the V carb drivers getting promoted, but it seems pretty heavily that the rumors, especially the way Max was asked about them and the way Max answered the question, that
Hmm.
the rumors are much more about Franco actually being the second driver next year at Red Bull.
Oh yeah, and I think I do think it makes a lot of sense why they would immediately promote him to the senior team. He's come into a Williams car, which is like notoriously not that high up the grid, but he's scoring points and
Hmm.
he's performing well, and I think that that's really impressive for a rookie, let alone someone who's had like less than 5 or 6 races under his belt now. I think
Yeah.
5 races. Who knows? But yeah, it's wildly impressive. I'm not surprised they want to promote him to a better seat because if he can do what he's doing in a Williams, I would not be surprised if he came in to a Red Bull and pulled off like a Max Verstappen Spain 2016 kind of race,
Yeah.
went on his first shot out. Like that would be really cool.
Yeah, and I also think he's proven so far that he is driving safely, but
Hmm.
taking risks, like calculated
Yes.
risks. I don't know that there's really a term for it in Formula One, but he
Hmm.
drives with a very clear understanding of or like a real maturity of making
Yes.
decisions, understanding what's a risk to take, what's not a risk to take. Um,
Definitely.
and I think he drives really well for that, and I think that is really important in that Red Bull
Hmm.
seat. It's not just about supporting Max or
Yeah.
about being a possible race winner. It's about being able to strategize with the team, to respond to
Yes.
calls, to drive as well as possible, and to score as many points as possible too.
And to work with the car to make it better
Hmm.
because I think that the whole thing around being like one of two drivers in the car, you're not just trying to drive it based on what the engineers give you. You also have to provide feedback to make the car better, to make sure the upgrades are working in the way that you want them to bring more helpful upgrades so that the car continues to evolve and perform as well as you want it to. So there are lots of layers to it. And it seems like Franco is doing all the things right so far, which is really cool to see at such a young age.
I would also say on top of everything that he brings to the track, the one other thing that he really brings to the team is a great understanding of social media and PR and personality. And I think that I really enjoy some of the stuff that they do with Checo and Max. And I think that sometimes when they have the time to do funny social media stuff, they especially this year, it's shifted. They have a little bit more of a rapport and fun together. I think that Williams has gotten an insane amount of good marketing from Franco just being himself. And
100%. The whole like, oh, don't buy the merch. It's like, I was like, what? Like, they let you say that? That's crazy. And it's clear that, like, obviously that he's just like kind of coming in fresh face, probably very little media training, but that authenticity, I think, makes him so much more likable. And then putting them next to Alex, who was already like a pretty likable character. I remember like I instantly just like became an Alex Albon fan when I just saw the videos of him and Max just hating on the marketing team at Red Bull. Like that was just like a funny bit that they did, but it was so good. And now I listen to Team Twerk every single week and I'm like, this is adorable. Franco's teaching Alex how to like drink mate. Like I love this so much.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think it's like I think you'd also have a similar dynamic between Max and Franco as you have right now and it would be fun. It would be good marketing. It's good for the sponsors. They've lost a lot of that charisma with losing Daniel and they're looking for a way to solve that kind of gap.
For sure.
I think that's a space too.
The McLaren strategy decision or like the VSC of it all.
So I think we started to touch on this earlier, but I think the important part about actually no, we touched on the sprint VSC. We have not touched on the actual race situation.
Grand Prix VSC,
the Grand Prix. Yes. So I think I would love to hear your take on the tire strategy because I've already gone on a large rant about how important math is. So I would love to hear how you felt about the choices that were made.
Okay. We see now that it was possible to stick it out without doing that first pit stop. Obviously, Charles came in before the VSC. More drivers came in during the VSC. Or most drivers came in during the VSC. And then as the VSC was ending, which if people do not know, the ending of the VSC is random. So they will say the VSC is ending, and then there will be like, I think it's between like a 12 and 15 minutes or seconds of it could go off in any time during that situation. The end of the VSC was called before George or Lando came into the pit lane. I am surprised that they didn't call them out because that would have been the worst. That was the worst time to come in. George made his feelings clear. Lando was also like, oh, so they all get a free pit stop after the red flag came out. Because very shortly after, you got the actual safety car. And then, who was that one? Oh, Nico went into the wall. Or, that caused the red flag.
Yeah. Or he didn't, I don't think he went into the wall, but he
was like beached.
He was like beached, basically. They had to kind of push him out.
Yeah. But that whole series of events, if Lando and George did not come into the pits in that moment, they would have probably finished 1-2. And that is the reality of the situation. And it freaking sucks that had to go that way, but it happened. I do think that safety wise, coming in was a good idea because it's better to have those tires that have more grip, especially when they're going off. I believe at that point in time, it was almost like half race distance. And these wet weather tires, theoretically, or like the inters, you can theoretically go a whole Grand Prix on them. Do you want to? No, because especially when the track starts drying, it starts getting slick and you don't want that. So I do think it was the right idea to pit it was the wrong time for George and Lando to pit.
So I'm curious for you because I was actually kind of split on this. What I thought was interesting was whose call it was on both, because it was
Mhm.
actually kind of a different situation for both of them. George very
Yes.
vehemently did not want to pit, as
Yeah.
he made known after the race,
Yeah.
and Lando was very
Really
much
wanted to pit.
arguing against his strategy team, who were telling him they did not want to pit him,
Yes.
and he ultimately pitted. And again, I have not listened to every moment of the team radio. I saw what
Same.
was broadcasted, so it's very possible there was a little bit more of a conversation than we heard, but we did hear a McLaren basically tell him very explicitly, "We don't want to pit you. Charles
Mhm.
pitted and is now coming out in traffic, and it is a problem. He's unable to pass these cars.
Yeah.
And so to pit you right now is going to cause a problem." And Lando continued to push back on it.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because I think sometimes we talk and we praise drivers for making their own strategy or going against the strategy team
Mhm.
or giving information that could be helpful. And quite honestly, if Lando's tires were at a point where he felt he was going to crash, then absolutely he should have come in, and
Yeah.
that just means that you sacrifice your race to do that.
Mhm.
Um, but I think it was interesting to see that the Mercedes team basically was like, "You need new tires, and we need to do it now." And the McLaren team, who we've really criticized for their strategy calls throughout the year, we saw them basically try to make the right strategy call, but not be able to based off of driver feedback.
Yeah. It's really tough when you look at it that way because it like again, it's one person versus the other. I think in rain, also there's like that whole other element of like the driver is the only one who actually knows what's going on track. I think that Lando probably assumed that being on this like a new set of inters would be helpful to him.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. George seemed so angry. I was like,
Yeah,
"Oh my goodness." And especially like all obviously hindsight is always 2020. When that red flag comes out, you're like, "Oh my gosh, all of these things could have gone my way
sure.
for all of these different reasons." But right now you're like or in the moment you have to make that split second decision and I think because I believe Lewis also pitted under the VSC
Mhm.
and Oscar was one of the first cars in the pit lane at the beginning of the VSC. So when you have all of that, you're like, okay, like my teammate is doing this, all of these things are happening. So I should be doing the same thing or I shouldn't be doing the same thing, just
Right.
counter strategy, making sure all of these things are working. So it could really, there's so many things that you could be like, oh, this could work, but also hindsight 2020.
Yeah, again, it's hard, like you say, hindsight's 2020. If you had given him 5 more minutes, would he have made a different decision? Or could they have, all been under the red flag?
Yeah.
All of that is totally fair. And when you look at it the same way you pointed out that Mercedes pitted under like with both George and with Lewis, you have a
Mhm.
different pit strategy. George
Mhm.
pitted not when he wanted to. It was after the VSC, obviously, and you have the same with Lewis having pitted before him under the
Yeah.
VSC. You have that element, but then you also have, like we mentioned earlier, we know that after the aborted start that the Mercedes adjusted their tire pressure, which is not allowed. So there's
Mhm.
so many different little things I think that happened this weekend that were so on a razor's edge of what gave you an advantage, what affected your
Yeah.
race, and knowing when to make those decisions. And unfortunately, it just didn't go well for Oscar and George. I mean,
Y
for Lando and George.
yes, unfortunate, and Lando really couldn't come back from that, and you had Esteban Ocon leading the race for a little bit there, which was crazy. Did I know Max was gonna pass him at some point? Yes, of course, but I there was a good while there where I was like, Esteban Ocon's pulling out an almost 3 to 4 second gap on Max Verstappen. Is he going to win this race?
Yeah.
Maybe.
There was also a period of time where I was like, "Are they gonna call it for weather?" Which would then put the classification where it is now.
Yeah.
And I was like, "Oh gosh, like Esteban Ocon Grand Prix winner again?"
Again?
But
Wait,
no.
but okay, this related to Esteban and
Yeah.
Pierre. Did
Yes.
we see them being best friends?
Okay, this is actually, you know what? I think this is perfect because there's so much about this race that we couldn't cover it all, honestly, and
Yes,
we've covered the
because
big
it's
tentpole
chaos.
moments. It's chaos.
I it I literally I still don't think do I want to go back and rewatch this race? Maybe not, because it was a lot of sensory overload. It was like,
Yeah.
okay, Fernando Alonso went off here, and then Lewis was like struggling for a while there, and then he finally gets past Checo. There was too much happening
Yeah.
all at once that I feel like we didn't get a holistic view of the whole race. But we did get an Alpine double podium.
Yes, and this is, I think, maybe the story we should end on because I think it is one of I love talking about storylines in sports, and I love looking at them as possible ways to get people into sports as well, because
Yes.
Esteban and Pierre hugging, like, if you just started watching Formula 1 this year, you have a little bit of an idea, but you have
Yeah.
no idea of how deep their friends to enemies to coworkers who also hate each other and now are hugging on a podium narrative goes. Um,
It's like,
it's all over the place. Which okay, so I was looking back at this actually because obviously I watched them after the race there. They
yeah.
both jumped into the arms of their team. I was already a
Yeah.
little teary-eyed, and then they both hugged, they posed for photos. There was like genuine excitement for each other.
Yes.
Oh, there's something was releasing in me. I was like, thank God, they're so
That
happy.
press conference where like, was it Pierre, or no, Esteban was looking at Pierre with so much love in his eyes, and I was like, where are we right now?
So my favorite thing was after this, because I was like, I want to talk about this with Neha for sure. I looked up I wanted to get some of the dates right back of their history.
Yes.
So I was rereading sort of how their relationship started, their feud, and like kind of how they've spoken about it. And
Mhm.
I went back and looked at this podcast where Pierre is talking about his relationship with Esteban, and he's talking about their history together and how they grew up and I don't remember if this part's in the podcast, but basically they met because Esteban's dad bought his first
Mhm.
go-kart from Pierre's brother, and then they grew
Mhm.
up on the same track. And at first they were really good friends. Like they literally lived 30 minutes apart growing up. Then
Mhm.
you have obviously their relationship gets more strained when they get more competitive and they start becoming like genuine rivals. But there is a
Mhm.
podcast episode where Pierre is talking about this, and he's talking about their relationship and their history, and he stops himself and is like, I'm talking about him as if he was my girlfriend. And that's how close they were. Like that's how
Yeah.
deep their relationship went. And then obviously then they turn into these like very deep rivals, starting with karting. They're, crashing into each other. They're going back and forth. They have different feelings. It's similar to the Max and Charles relationship that has
Yeah.
been, so publicized with nothing, just an incident. And so you have this energy of like, okay, they were such good friends and then they were
Yeah.
such deep enemies. And then you have them both make it to Formula One. They're making their own sort of move for themselves, and they crash in 2018 against each other. And then in 2023 they get announced as teammates, and everyone is like, what if that might be a bad idea?
Yeah. And then Australia happens, which was crazy.
Yep.
I think it's just always been like little contentious moments here and there that have just like built up this crazy narrative.
Yeah.
And I think one of my favorite things was, I think they were both at Cannes and they were both in the same like line of people, and they
Mm.
just cut each other out of their photos. And I'm like, that it's like, it was basically not even bordering petty. At some points, it was genuinely petty.
Super. Yeah.
But to have two people from a really small town in France come to Formula One and be competing with each other for a French team, crazy. Like,
Yeah.
the reality of the situation is, it's insane because the odds are so tiny. But to be doing that and then to allow them to celebrate the way that they did makes me really happy. I'm really glad that they celebrated in like this wholesome and like friendship way, because truly they were friends, rivals, enemies, everything but lovers. So that's truly what the storyline is.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think also I was really happy for Esteban in particular because I think he really got the brunt of it this year, especially
Hmm.
after Monaco, and
Yeah.
when he again did sort of drive over Pierre's car, and it was a
Yeah.
dangerous move and sort of came out of nowhere. No one really understood
Hmm.
why. And then you have the team very publicly saying that there will be consequences, and then it's announced that he will not be renewed with the team.
Yeah.
And so it's such a bitter, it was set to be such a bitter end. And
Yeah.
also just an extra level of layer to their kind of rivalry of like
Yeah.
Esteban was there first, then Pierre comes over, and then now Pierre's the golden child, and Esteban's like, but I did this first, I was here first, this is my
I want to
space.
race for you, like all
Yeah.
of these things.
And now you were leaving in such a deep like way of sort of like, oh, I guess Pierre gets the kids and the divorce, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But but now instead we get to end with like, you end with the hug, you end with the just genuine like happiness for each other, you end with the beautiful podium, and then them like scrunching down to give the
Yeah.
not champagne, sparkling wine, whatever, to the team, to the
Yeah.
garage guys. And
I love when they do that. It makes me so happy. Where it's like you can see, because it, again, not just the drivers who win the race, it's the team, it's the pit crew, it's the engineers. Seeing the joy on their faces. I think they kept zooming in on like one person during the podium ceremony who was so emotional, because even though it was the Dutch and Austrian national anthems that were getting played, the two French drivers from the same team also on the podium, there was like so much emotion there, and it's so special to see that.
It really is. And then also like one of my favorite things was seeing the team principal actually get like an interview in the main feed. Like realized, I was like, I actually don't remember the last time we saw him on F1 TV. Like, this is lovely. I'm so happy.
And this is also like his first, like, he came in mid-season too. Like, he's brand new to the team. So this is a huge win, especially given where Alpine started at the beginning of the season. Like, in my race recaps, there's just been this lasting Alpine category, and they'd always be at the bottom because I'm like, what is Alpine doing? And for the first time, they moved up, and I was like, oh my gosh, Alpine, like, you did the thing. And I was talking to Dev, Formula Dev.
Yeah.
She loves to talk about like the history and all of the things that have like happened in F1 history. But Flavio Briatore, who came in, announced that he was coming back to F1 during the Spanish Grand Prix weekend, I believe.
Yes, I think you're right.
The amount of chaos this man has brought to Renault, and now it seems like it was meant to be. It feels like there was a 1-2 somewhere that happened. It's the powers of Travis Kelce, Patrick Mahomes, and Ryan Reynolds coming together with Flavio Briatore.
It's a true infinity gauntlet of people for Alpine. There was a snap finally made. You know what I mean? I think as much as this was a race that I want to talk about Max, I want to talk about everybody else and everything like that, I think the true story of this race is Alpine.
I agree.
Yeah. I was so proud.
And I'm so happy for them. I'm genuinely really happy. At first, I was like, should I be like happy? This is like really confusing. But also, when you look at it, they jumped from 9th to 6th in the constructors, which is an additional $50 million in prize money. That's a lot of money.
It's huge. It's a lot of money. Huge situation there. Yeah, I'm like, I need for my wall behind me now, I've got to add the picture of the two of them after the race. Like, it's a moment. It's a moment that we got to put it in. So,
and we might never see it again, and that's crazy.
Agreed. Actually, we probably will never see it again, and so that's a bummer.
We can hope. We can hope for another, or it's never gonna, or the next 3 races, who knows what's gonna happen.
Yeah.
Vegas could also bring chaos. Could also bring, all of these races could be absolutely horrible. But we could see French Peen all over again. Who knows?
Who knows? Well, we are actually at the point of the episode where we talk about our future predictions. So this is a perfect timing for that. Do you have any? We have a number of weeks off, and then we go to Vegas, Qatar, and Abu Dhabi, and we're done.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, we're done. It's been a long one. It's been a crazy one. Okay, I think if you asked me before Brazil, I would have said that Ferrari was going to take the Constructors' Championship. I do think that McLaren kind of has one hand on it now because of Carlos Sainz's DNF. I do think Max is going to take the Drivers' Championship. But I also think that, I think it's going to be McLaren, Ferrari, Red Bull in that order. And Max, Lando, Charles in that order. So
I agree.
Yeah.
It's not an exciting call, but it is, I think, the right call.
Like, I don't know how far Ferrari are from McLaren now in the constructors standings, but if there is a world in which Ferrari randomly surpasses McLaren, because I do think that the Vegas track does suit their car better.
Yeah.
I also think that Abu Dhabi will be better for them, but Qatar will be better for McLaren.
Hmm.
So when you look at it that way, if there is enough points there where if the double Ferrari can somehow get the best of the double McLaren, I mean, you never know. And like that's the fun thing about predictions, isn't it? Like you don't know until you know.
Yeah. I think for me, I feel pretty solid that Max will take the World Drivers' Championship now. I think
Oh, for
that's
sure.
pretty settled. I actually would love to be like proven next, when we get to Vegas, I would love to
Mhm.
see Lando suddenly like knock it back out of the park and bring
Yeah.
back the conversation. I just think with the point spread, it's a little bit more difficult to see it
Because now it's
happening.
over 60, isn't it? I think
I
if
think
it
so,
was,
yeah.
yeah, if it was anywhere like 40, I think I'd feel a little bit, or like Lando could potentially do something. I think Max is locked in now, like so
Yeah.
locked in. I think it's going to be hard. Like Lando's going to need to pull out all the stops, then Max is going to need to DNF 2 of the 3 races.
Yeah. Yeah, and I also think, one thing I'm excited to see actually, but I don't know what it's gonna look like. I do think Vegas is gonna be a little bit of a wild card because it was
Hmm.
already so chaotic last year and ended up
Yeah,
being, I think, one of the most exciting races of the season.
for sure.
However, this year they're adding in having a support race,
Hmm.
for this race, which will be another element of making sure that the track is clear, that there's no other
Yes.
situations like the manhole covers, the
Hmm.
drain covers.
Yeah.
That there's no situation like the drain cover that came out underneath Carlos's car last year. You've got a whole extra element to that track and keeping it raceable that is going to be
Yes.
interesting. So I
I
don't
think it's
know.
just going to be fast.
Yeah.
And who knows? Maybe we'll end up there.
Yeah.
I keep
Hopefully.
saying that. I keep just like putting it out into the universe. I'm like, we're totally going to Vegas. Like, what do you mean?
I'm just gonna be there. I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm like, it's so close. I'd love to be there. It's definitely the last race that I could see myself attending this year since
same.
there's I don't see myself getting to Abu Dhabi on a 24-hour flight.
Would I love to? Yes. Am
But I
I
love
going to?
I'm
No.
available.
Yeah.
I'm here for it. I
I
just
could if there something comes up, I would happily,
I would be there.
hop on a plane.
Yeah. Well, this has been really fun, Neha. Thank you. I'm so
Yeah.
glad. I'm always happy to have someone else who wants to talk about the intensity of like the minutia of this sport, and nerd out a little bit. And
Oh yeah. I'm
you
your
know,
girl.
you are every time. So it was very fun. I enjoyed it. I hope everybody else enjoyed it. And hopefully you learned something. We did try to talk about a little bit more of this was a really technical race. So I feel like hopefully we got through something that maybe you didn't know about the sport, or maybe we changed your mind about the way something happened today. I don't know, but I feel like we had a quite educational episode today. So I appreciate
Yes.
your guesting.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was so much fun.
Of course, anytime, you're always welcome. If
Oh.
people would like to find you on the internet, what is your username? Where can they find you?
My username is at Neha K. Sridhar on all platforms. I don't really use Twitter X, but TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, I'm on there. I talk about Formula One, tennis, sometimes cricket, football. I'm all over the place. So
She's a jack of all trades. She loves a sport. If it's got
I
a
love a sport.
if it has a score, she'll talk about it. So
Yes, but happily.
well, thank you again, Neha. I had so much fun.
Yeah, me too.
Always, if you don't want to watch these races alone, you can join the actual grid chat. I host a group chat of motorsports fans where fan behavior is encouraged, and there's no such thing as a stupid question. We watch these races live together, chat about breaking news, and of course, send each other an unhealthy amount of memes. If you'd like to join the grid chat, you can do so at tandemproductions.com/gridchat. There will also be a link to that in the episode description. Once you fill out the form on the webpage there, you'll get an invite via email from me. If you want to connect, let me know what you thought about the episode, or even just ask me another question that you'd like me to cover on the show. You can find me on all social media platforms at Marissa Kamari. And one of the best ways to connect with me is if you're listening to this podcast on Herd FM. You can find me in the community section on Herd FM, where my username is just my first name, Marissa. And once we follow each other, after every episode that you listen to, I'll be able to comment and have a conversation with you directly. So again, my username on Herd FM is Marissa. As always, I've been your host, Marissa Tandon, and thank you for joining the Grid Chat.